In Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, we learn that Abram believed in God, and God counted him as righteous because of his belief. This verse is really important and shows up 3 times in the New Testament. However, some people misunderstand it, thinking it means that just believing in God is enough to be saved or justified, like getting a free pass. But that's not the full story. The Apostle Paul uses this verse to teach that being saved is open to everyone, not by just following old laws perfectly, but by having a faith that leads to action. Paul was especially trying to help Jewish Christians who were stuck on the idea that they still had to follow all the old laws from Moses' time. This verse is quoted 3 times in the New Testament, and many in the religious world use it to teach that we are saved or justified without works. But that is not the meaning of this passage. The first time it is quoted is in Romans chapter 4. In that chapter, Paul's goal is to teach that salvation and justification are available to everyone by obedient faith in God and not by perfect law-keeping. Many of the Jewish Christians were having a hard time letting go of the law of Moses. We learn more about the background of Romans chapter 4 by reading Romans chapter 3 verse 29. Or is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Since there is one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. Many of the Jews wanted the Gentiles to be circumcised, which was a problem Paul dealt with during his first missionary journey. Paul is teaching them that justification is obtained through faith and not through circumcision. He uses Abraham to prove his point in Romans chapter 4 verse 1. What then shall we say that Abraham our father has found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Abraham was not under the law of Moses, and before he was circumcised, he was counted righteous by his faith. Romans chapter 4 verse 9, does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. For the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. When it says by his faith, it does not mean he just believed, but that he had an obedient faith. For example, it took an obedient faith for him to listen to God and go to a place he had never been before. As the writer of Hebrews records, Hebrews 11 verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. Verse 9, by faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. Paul does not teach that we are justified by faith alone, or by perfect law-keeping, but he does point out the necessity of an obedient faith throughout his letters. Romans 1 verse 5, 2 verse 8, 6 verse 17, 15 verse 18, 16 verses 19 and 26, 2 Corinthians 2 verse 9, Galatians 3 verse 1, 5 verse 7, Philippians 2 verse 12, 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 8, 3 verse 14, Philemon 1 verse 21. The second place our passage is quoted is in Galatians 3. Again, Paul uses this verse about Abraham to prove that we are not justified under the law of Moses or by works of merit. Galatians 3 verse 5, therefore, he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you, does he do it by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? Verse 6, just as Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Verse 7, therefore know that only those who are of faith are sons of Abraham. Verse 8, And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, "In you all the nations shall be blessed." Verse 9. So then those who are of faith are blessed with believing Abraham. Verse 10. For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them." Verse 11. But that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Paul was doing his best to teach these Christians that they should not go back to the law of Moses, because a person cannot be justified under it. He also taught them that if they try to be justified by the law of Moses, they will fall from grace. Galatians 5, verse 4. Again, Paul is not saying we have no part in our salvation because we must have an obedient faith to accept God's grace, but we cannot earn our salvation, be justified by the works of the law of Moses, or be justified by works of merit. The third time our passage about Abraham is quoted is in James 2. James proves that this saying about Abraham does not mean we are justified by belief alone, but that it takes an obedient faith. James 2, verse 20. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Verse 21. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Verse 22. Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? Verse 23. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Verse 24. You see then that a man is justified by works, and not by faith only. Using the same verse Paul quoted, James proves that justification comes from an obedient faith and not by faith alone. If we are saved by faith alone, were these people saved? John 12, verse 42. Nevertheless, even among the rulers many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. Verse 43. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. I think most would agree they were not. But if you believe that all one has to do is believe in Jesus, then you would have to say they were saved. If not, why not? In conclusion, the journey from Genesis through the writings of Paul and James teaches us something vital. Being right with God is not about simply saying we believe or strictly following old laws. It's about a faith that is alive and shows itself through what we do. By looking at Abraham's life, we see that he didn't just believe in God quietly. He acted on his faith, like moving to a new land because God told him to. These actions showed his true faith. So Abraham's story teaches us that real faith must include both belief and actions. This is what makes us right with God, not just our words or beliefs alone. It's a reminder to all of us that our faith should lead us to live in ways that show we truly believe in and follow God.